So, welcome back. It's time to get started again. Thank you for those of you who had to run out to other jobs or teaching or what have you. Thanks for coming back. I will now introduce Karen Rommelfanger, who's going to give us a talk about not I am who I am and she is who she is, but when I becomes we, ethical implications of emerging brain-to-brain interfacing technologies. So please join me in welcoming her.
Okay, thanks for having me today. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. So I'd like to start by telling a little bit, just a small little biography. That I went into neuroscience because I wanted to understand what I thought the emotional basis of the self, emotional basis of the brain. At the time, there was not a neuroscience major that I could take part of, so I went into chemistry. And then I realized, well, if I want to study the molecules involved in emotion, I need to move into a behavioral model, and went to graduate school. And I did an internship in undergrad in designing PET ligands for brain imaging, and I ended up in a Parkinson's lab. And I found out that studying emotion at that time would probably be too soft of a science, and no one would take me seriously, I thought. So I decided I'd study emotion in Parkinson's disease. So I moved into neurodegenerative disorders, largely Parkinson's disease. And from there I went through basically every model from cells to non-human primates. And I remember at one point I was sitting in the lab and I was doing a live recording of a single unit recording in a monkey. And I was watching its eyes move. It was one of the hardest positions I've ever had. And I was listening. What we do is we transform the electrical activity from recordings into sound. And so you can hear where you are, you can hear the characteristic activity of the cell. And I had this thought, this is not where the mind is. What am I doing? It's not where emotions are. I have got to go to another place. And from there came my slow journey into neuroethics. So it's been a funny road for me. And somebody brought up psychogenic disorders earlier, and for those of you who weren't here, it was brought up that somebody had a DBS intervention for something that wasn't actually a tremor or whatever it was he had. And psychogenic disorders are things that resemble other organic disorders, and I use that kind of loosely, like epilepsy, but without the characteristic abnormal activity in the brain. And they're thought to be emotional in origin. And what I study there is what happens when we change the locus of, so I'm interested in when we think about the locus of the self, or we think about the locus of illness, how do we privilege one organ versus the other, and how does that impact the quality of life of somebody involved in that situation? And so psychogenic disorders also show us what happens when we privilege physical processes over things we consider as non-physical. But I'll leave it there. So disclaimers. And I have to give these because I've given this talk a few times and I always get people believing this anyway. Mind reading is not possible. These technologies. I'm not here advocating for mind reading or saying that I want to read your mind. Afterwards, if you know someone who isn't reading your mind, I won't know who to call other than the police. So please reach out to them on your own. Neuroscientists don't know what thoughts are. And I challenge you to ask a neuroscientist to define that for you, to tell you how the basic unit of the brain cell, turns what is the exact path from that activity to a thought. There will not be a good one who can tell you that. And so because we don't know that, we can't actually transfer them. This is not telepathy, and by telepathy I mean not transmission of complex ideas or emotions. That's not where we are yet. That's not possible. However, you can do anything on WikiHow, and through 7 simple steps you can learn how to prepare to perform telepathy. So once again, I refer you there for that question. On science. Statistical significance tells the likelihood of something and does not prove truth. So oftentimes, I think this was part of my upbringing in the lab. This is the strongest critique, that it wasn't statistically significant, the N wasn't big enough, so therefore it's not true. If I just get my N big enough and I just use the right statistics, this is the truth, and science as an entity has told us so. And it's not. It's a number and it's a probability. And actually I have this joke that never really goes over well, but I keep telling it. Maybe I don't tell it well. Let me try it again. So there's a group of scientists in a room, and a pig walks in, and he says, "Hi, everybody." And then one of the scientists says, "Hey, look, a talking pig." And the other scientists say, well, it's only an N of 1. And science does not tell us what is right or wrong. People do. And technologies aren't inherently good or bad. Their use, dictated by people, is what determines this. So we did not coordinate this, but I also have 3 things up here. So first I started out by talking about cultural representations of the brain. The so-called essential brain, people have already used that wording earlier. Technologies as subjects or objects, actually is related to something, a question Tim brought up earlier. The developments in brain-to-brain interface, the hope and the hype, and the implications for reconceptualizing the self. What can we, these technologies are really brand new. What can we learn from other related technologies? And what can we even learn from other cultures? And I don't mean looking at other cultures as putting them under the magnifying glass as the curious other, but to reflect upon ourselves by looking at others and see what we might learn from exploring those different perspectives. So, cultural representations of the self. This is the evolution of ape to the selfie stick. So what are some of the cultural representations of the brain? One conceptual framework is thinking of the brain as essential to who we are. It is the brain is the essence of ourselves, the brain as a subject or the person, the brain as a basis for personality, and Francois has brought up some interesting distinctions between personality and personal identity. And what are some representations in the media? The brain is described as object, as a sentient being, as a complex network, as embodied plasticity. Plasticity is another one of those buzzwords like interdisciplinary that doesn't really mean anything. A functional device, a self-organizing system, and probably most controversial, a causal agent, challenging notions of free will and responsibility. And I'm also mindful of Francois's very important comment about using imagery. And I did kind of toil between what I want to do with pretty images and how much they might cause too much power. There's not more influence you can get than a brain with lightning bolts in it. But there is a paper by some researchers who asked participants where they thought the locus of their self was, in the brain or in the heart. And based on whether they thought their locus of their self was in the brain versus the heart, they made different ethical decisions. So it's important how you conceptualize yourself. So those who thought that the self was in the brain might be think abortion was more permissive at certain stages because the brain isn't fully developed and therefore you aren't there. Or even something like brain death. Brain death is not a formal legal standing in China. Actually, before organ donation, you can choose. You want to be brain dead, brain and heart dead. And this isn't just in China. I have a colleague whose father passed away, and he had a long time at home with hospice care, and her mother was tending to him all the time, and her daughter said, my friend said, you've got to just go out and take care of yourself, go get your hair done, or whatever it is you want to do. So she went out, and she got stuck in horrible traffic. And when she came back, she had missed when he breathed his last breath, and she was devastated. But it had just happened when she walked in the door, and my friend was there, and her mom was devastated. Oh my God, I missed him when he left. And she said, wait, listen. And she put her head on his chest, and the heart was still beating. You can still say goodbye. Right? So in that case, it was kind of an interesting moment of when did she think he was truly gone? For her, on a practical level, it was when she stopped hearing that auditory signal of his heart and stopped feeling that beat. And there are implications broader than just thinking about, well, who am I as myself? But our intuitive views about how we consider the self actually impact law, life and death. When are we actually dead? When does life start? And aspirations for human flourishing. Is this body just kind of useless baggage that's attached to the really meaningful brain that I have? Should I really just be working on enhancing my brain? We have this conference series called Zombethics, Zombies and Zombethics, where we use zombies as a point of departure for discussing tough ethical topics. And we brought in our palliative care director, and she said that one of the most common questions she gets with a patient towards the end of their life is if there's a way, as far as their organs go, is there a way to preserve their brain? there's something special about the essence of who they are, they think, in their brain. Joe Ledoux is a well-known memory and emotion researcher. From his book, he says, people don't come pre-assembled, but are glued together by life. Experiences and genes shape the synaptic organization of the brain. The particular patterns of synaptic connections in the individual's brain and the information encoded by these connections are the keys to who that person is. So a neuron isn't just a neuron, it's the key to who one is. Who we are is how we think, and how we think is based on those the encoded information between neurons. There's also this idea that self is information experience that connects sensation, emotion, and consciousness. And we've talked about the pushback against self as a static entity bounded by unique bodies and unique narratives. So is there a neural code for human experience and human narrative? How are narratives and memories constructed? So in this study, the researcher asked, Itzhak Fried asked, is there a neural substrate for memory reactivation? And what he did was he had patients who were already implanted with electrodes for epilepsy, and these electrodes were implanted on their brain. And he showed them images of a laptop while data was recorded from individual neurons in their hippocampus, an area of the brain associated with memory. And he found that activity increased when viewing famous actors and actresses like Josh Brolin and Marilyn Monroe. I didn't know who Josh Brolin was, but he's from the Goonies, in case you can't remember. And so this is interesting. So now we see when participants were viewing things that were familiar to them, it seemed like there was this activation in these neurons at the single cell level. So this one might ask, are we simply electrical currents mediated by brain cells? Is that it? And is that really disappointing, or is that exciting? And then there's another researcher, Gavin Re, who's collaborated with one of our neuroethics fellows in the past, who has gone quite to the extreme level to explore ideas of the self and whether he could be constructed by simply cells. So he calls this project a cybernetic self-portrait. He harvested his own skin cells. They were induced into pluripotent stem cells, differentiated into neurons. Here they are here. They were grown on a microelectrode array, and they responded to a drummer via a synthesizer. And he said, I always wanted to be a rock star, and now I am via these cells. And he says, these cells are an external brain, and they have a synthesizer body. But what's interesting to him with all of his projects, and he's been doing projects with cells in a dish for a while, is that he always has to have an interactive element to them, because he says that they don't really have an identity until they interact with another agent. And you can go to Gavin Re's site to see the video if you want. It sounds like avant-garde music. So this technology, is technology a subject or an object? You know, in what we saw before, it kind of seems that the cells were not just an object or a tool, they were or a passive tool, it was a collaborator. And do we use tools for documenting the selves, or do we use tools for realizing the selves, as Joe Finn said earlier? Or are our cells agents in their own right? And here you might recall these are selfies. So what are the purpose of selfies? What do people do with selfies? This is the famous Naruto Selfie. Anybody familiar with that? The monkey stole the photographer's camera and took pictures of himself, and then there were questions of who owned the image. So this is a free image. I try to always pull free images. So this is not, and PETA tried to argue that this was Naruto's image, but then since Naruto is not really a person, he can't own things, not a legal person. And this person, this is a project where someone's developed a Selfie Stick solo cam. So this is for reporters who want to do it all on your own. You have the Selfie Stick on steroids, basically. And you know, while that's kind of an indirect connection, I even have my phone up here. It has pictures of my son on the front. It has what's going to happen in my life in the next few hours and the next few days. And I'd be pretty distraught without it. And do I see this as an extension of myself? I actually kind of do. It's certainly a critical part of myself. Is it for documenting the self? Is it for realizing myself? And while some people might have more difficult time imagining, well, how is this really part of myself? Look how separate it is from me. The more connected and the more penetrated it is into our skin, the more we start questioning, at least on it seems like there's this aesthetic that once you penetrate the skin, it intimately becomes part of me, or maybe even a violation of me. Is interesting what Francois brought up earlier with the DBS patient who didn't want to have the ability to control the pacemaker by inserting it discreetly under his skin. But it becomes a lot more complicated when actually the other technology is another brain. And this work was done back here, and one of those researchers is in the audience. So you guys can ask him any challenging questions at the end. So now we move on to brain-to-brain interface. Recent developments, the hope and the hype. So first, brain-machine interfaces link biological circuits in the brain to external devices like computer cursors, robotic prostheses, communication aids. And you've probably seen these in the news. Actually, that was shown with the brain gate as well as with the arm that could play guitar. And they've also been developed for therapeutic purposes and heavily developed for performance enhancement within the military context. And they're also used for understanding basic information processing circuitry in the brain. And at this stage, brain-to-brain interface has not been developed within a clinical context. It's been primarily developed for understanding information processing circuitry in the brain. More simply, brain-to-brain interface technologies are designed as communication devices. The goal of these devices is to allow two or more non-human or human-animal brains to exchange or share motor, sensory, or cognitive information to achieve a behavioral goal. And I wanted to bring up a point about communication, because I think this is an interesting point someone brought up earlier. Does communication give us the ability to be authentic or legitimate selves and legitimate persons? We kind of do that for people. If you don't speak my language, you're not really there. In a country where we're mainly monolingual, we often see a lot of exclusion based on those who aren't native English speakers. For people who are autistic, they don't speak the language that we speak, so we have trouble just understanding that they have valuable conversations in their own right. For animals who we don't understand, they're not really persons because they don't communicate with us in the way we expect them to. So what happens when we disrupt the communication paradigm? So how do these work? They basically require two capabilities, the ability to extract information and to deliver information. And this can be done invasively or non-invasively. The goal for humans is to obviously have them be non-invasive. DBS is not ideal. Electrodes directly on the brain are not ideal. Primarily animal studies are being done with more invasive devices. But the studies that I'll show you today are a combination and an evolution from invasive to less or non-invasive, and from animals to humans. So to extract information, invasively you can use multi-electrode arrays, as I showed with the self experiment. Or you could use EEG, which is an external cap with electrodes in it that you can wear on your scalp. To deliver information, there's intracranial microstimulation, that's invasive, that's electrode in your brain. Or transcranial magnetic stimulation, or focused ultrasound, that's external delivery of information. That is non-invasive. And I'll talk a little bit more about those technologies. So neural recordings. So in the first experiment where I showed you pictures of Josh Brolin and the Goonies, they were using electrocortography, ECOG, and it's applied directly to the brain, and you can do recordings that way. But in these studies, they use non-invasive EEG, which detects sums of electrical activity in the brain through electrodes as flat metal discs next to the scalp. And they provide relatively poor spatial resolution but good temporal resolution. So again, this is non-invasive. For invasive, this is an image we've, I think, seen a couple times now. This is Kath, but she hasn't been named. This is Kathy Hutchinson, part of one of the initial brain gate experiments. She, from a stroke, is unable to use her arms and legs, and is utilizing a device like this that's smaller than a dime for scale and connected through wires to operate this arm. They've worked mightily for a long time, a lot of sweat and tears, I think, so that she was able to deliver herself her favorite drink, a cinnamon latte. It has multiple penetrating electrodes, typically in the cortex. It detects electrical activity from nearby neurons or groups of neurons. The more electrodes you have, the better. The more information you have, the better. The more accuracy you'll have. And that is what the researchers are working, Lee Hochberg and others are doing now. It allows for high spatial resolution and temporal resolution, and it can also be used to stimulate. You can devise one of these to stimulate. But one thing I wanted to point out is even these researchers, with their careful measured conversations and attempts to be careful in the media, still on their website show that BrainGate has this little line, tagline after it, turning thought into action. If you were to press those researchers on whether they believe that they know what thoughts are, actually they say no. And I've even seen scare quotes used around thought when the researchers talk about this themselves. But this is kind of the reality, the difficulty and the lack of linguistic terms that you can use that accurately capture the uncertainty and balance what you know. For neurostimulation, there's non-invasive transcranial magnetic stimulation. In this case, it uses magnetic pulses above the scalp to create electric current in nearby neurons. The current can stimulate or inhibit brain regions nearby. It's not focal, nor is it typically penetrating beyond the cortex, although its work is in progress to make this to be able to penetrate deeper. And then there's non-invasive focused ultrasound, which has been used for a number of purposes, but in this case, it's being used to, uses high acoustic energy beyond the audible level, it's ultrasound, to focally stimulate or inhibit deep structures, so this can go into deep structures. And it's basically like focusing acoustic sounds like you would sunlight through a magnifying glass. And then there's invasive intracranial microstimulation, where current flows from a microelectrode tip into nearby neurons, and it can be used for recording or stimulation. It also can penetrate deep structures. So now I want to give you a very brief overview of the timeline and the rapid nature of this timeline and the development of these technologies, and then we'll watch a few videos on some of these technologies. So first, in February 2013, Miguel Nicolelis' group out of Duke showed sensorimotor transmission between two rat brains. Basically, one rat was trained to press the correct lever for food, the other one without any training and only electrical stimulation from the rat who already knew how to press a lever was able to correctly choose the lever that would reward him. The second study happened not long after that. It was not two rats, now it was a human and a rat, cross-species neural interfacing, and it was non-invasive on the human side, and actually semi-invasive, I'd say, on the rat side. They did pull back the skin in order to deliver the focused ultrasound message. But in this case, through focused attention of the human, the person was able to elicit a tail flick in a rat tail, in a rat. Then in August, there was her first human-to-human brain interface. And this is a little tricky because there was a news release earlier than this publication on work coming out of here at UW that was not in the peer-reviewed article, but revealed that this human-to-human brain interface work was happening here at UW. Regardless, in August 2014, there were two individuals who were able to basically deliver the message of ciao or hola, kind of in the form of Morse code, and I'll talk more about that. Then, human-to-human interface to play a game to protect a city from being a video game to protect a city from being decimated by bombs. So we're grateful to them for that. And then a little bit out of order, that group then stepped it up even further, and they weren't just playing a game now. Now they were really playing for real, 20 questions. They stepped it up. And in the midst of all that, Nicolelis came back and said, well, I'm not going to connect just two brains. That's for you guys. I'm going to connect 3, 4, 5 brains. I'm going to call it the brain net. And he connected rodents and monkeys, and rodents were able to transfer virtual tactile information, but I'm really going to focus more on the monkey study, where monkeys were able together to work to operate an avatar arm in 3 dimensions. So first on rat-to-rat interface. I'll go through these a couple times, and the reason I do this is one, to kind of show you how complicated it is. 2, this is related to what Francois says, these are kind of pretty stylized pictures, but in reality, you know, you've got to, for this case at least, this is one pretty wire line dried onto the skull. Actually, there's drilling, there's screwing, there's blood, it's not pretty like this. and therefore probably not as fantastical seeming. And just so you can see this, how difficult this is in this model and how difficult that might be to translate into the near future. But regardless, you should see that this is being done, and this is area of work that's moving pretty quickly. So first, this is a pictorial representation of an encoder rat and a decoder rat. One rat is designated the encoder, who will receive a visual cue, and the other is the decoder, who will not. A light is switched on in the trained rat, and then in the encoder rat's cage, who is able to choose this lever. And when the encoder rat sees the light, presses a lever, receives reward, that signal is sent to the decoder rat, who then is able to press the correct lever without a light cue to get a reward. And as feedback, the other rat gets a signal. And the author says that this helps to refine the signal that's being sent back and forth from the encoder to the decoder. So let's watch a little video of that.
Wirelessly connected via electrical implants in their brains. The rat on the left is called the encoder. It knows that when it depresses a lever, it will receive a reward. What it doesn't know is that the electrical signals generated in its brain are being transmitted wirelessly in real time to the brain of the rat on the right, the decoder, who responds as though the brain signal was its own. According to neurobiologist Miguel Nicolelis, the decoder's brain then sends its own signal back to the encoder, who receives a supplemental reward.
That was a big surprise, and is the proof that these guys are collaborated, even though they don't know that there is another animal in another box doing the task. We virtually created a biological computer.
Nicolelis says that whenever the decoder rat made a mistake, the encoder rat would change its brain function to make the signals clearer next time, thereby ensuring it receives its reward.
This is a very exciting future line of research that will open many doors, not only for brain-machine interfaces in terms of rehabilitation, but potentially for something in the very distant future that I like to call the brain net, a way in which we will be able to communicate just by thinking.
Okay. So he said in the distant future would be the brain net, but so that was 2013, and then 2015 was his brain net publication. So in their paper, they claim the following, and I just want you to see, so you saw the experiment, you heard a little bit about it, and I want you to see what's at the end. I tried to cut and paste text from the end of these articles to show what they believed happened. And they claim that they demonstrated for the first time that tactile and motor information extracted in real time from simultaneously recorded populations of cortical neurons from a rat brain can be transmitted directly to another subject, into another subject. So then we move on from rat to rat interface, from human to rat interface. And I'll show you a video of this too. So in this case, a human subject focused on a target while EEG information was recorded from his brain. And then that was transferred and transformed by a computer into a focused ultrasound signal that stimulated over the rat's exposed skull and then induced a tail flick. And they did this with 6 humans and 6 rats. So a green light will flash in the left corner, and that indicates when the participant has paid attention. And then there's a tail flick. You want to see it again? Or was that kind of boring? Well, maybe we can't see it again, but that's what you'll see again. It blew everyone's mind. It can't exist anymore. So the thing to consider there is that if I could get that to show again, is that there are a number of problems using EEG like artifacts. So you always don't want to move muscles that would introduce artificial signals into the cat. And what's interesting about this video, which I was kind of surprised that they would release this as a supplemental figure because it's so damning, is that the human participant actually moves. You might see a little head jerk before the signal is even sent. So it's kind of, I'm not sure how much of a pure EEG signal that was, but that was what this experiment was. And they say this demonstrates the feasibility of a computer-mediated interfacing of neural signals between a human and an animal to generate a simple motor response. And while this is really preliminary, I don't even know if it worked, but if they continue to try to refine this, there's an interesting scenario that could happen. So while right now the model is the human to the rat, what would happen if we developed a model that went the other way? And would that give us more concern, less concern? Would that change the way we do our IACUC approvals and our animal study approvals? Would this enter into IRB human subjects experiment, or would it, or I guess it does a little bit of both? So here is the human brain-to-brain interface video. This work was done here with 3 senders and 3 receivers. And the goal of this was to shoot a rocket out of the sky in a video game and prevent it from just decimating a city. So what you had was one person, the sender, with the EEG cap on, watching a video, and they get to see a target and decide whether they need to fire a cannon or not. And then when they decide, an EEG recording goes across an internet signal, is transferred through the internet, and that induces brain stimulation via TMS, which induces an involuntary finger movement over a keyboard, which is able to press a key to shoot actually fire the cannon. And here's a picture of what it looks like. I don't know if some of these students are here in the audience, but there they are in all their glory. And we'll watch a video of this. So again, here's the model again. EEG from the sender transmits a signal that causes a TMS stimulation in the receiver. This is the setup, firing cannon at rockets from a pirate ship, but not supply planes, so it's very specific. And here's the EEG recording of the sender. And they're supposed to imagine hitting the target when it becomes relevant, when the rocket comes through the sky. I wasn't really able to see it on this screen, but I trust that it's happening.
Yes. Success.
Kind of watch it just for that cheery moment.
I'm going to go play that game right now.
Yeah. And here's the other view. You can see the person on the other end whose finger is going to move after receiving the TMS signal. See it? If you're ever having a bad day, just watch this video. I've already done it a couple times. Okay, and so in this study, you can see that it wasn't, I don't know what you pictured before I showed you these images, but it kind of seems a little more pedestrian, not as sci-fi when you see it in action, right? But they say this is the first real-time, non-invasive human brain-to-brain interface where individuals were cooperatively performing a task, a game of shooting rockets. And then I won't show you a video of this because it took 45 minutes for it to happen. But the next study between humans was to deliver a message, either hola or ciao. And so one individual, an emitter here, focused on imagining either moving hands or feet, which would correlate to either a 0 or a 1, and then that EEG signal would be sent, and the receiver on the other end would get a TMS stimulation over an area of the brain that would induce a light flash, and from that they were able to characterize put together the letters, and it was basically Morse code. Again, the transmission took 45 minutes, and they had only one receiver and 3 emitters. So this is very small. And I show you this because, one, it's a beautiful image, and you can see how this is stylized, but also to show you how complex this is. So you have someone imagining either moving their hands or feet, and then that electrical activity is taken from the EEG cap, then processed by a computer, goes through the internet. In this case, the message was emailed, and then a robot translates that information into a TMS signal that delivers a light flash for the individual, and then they consciously perceive that light flash. And so in this case, unlike the previous study where the person unconsciously, without voluntarily moving the finger, in this case someone was perceiving the light flash and understanding the information from there. Because of that, the authors say that this is a mind-to-mind and not a brain-to-brain interface. That conscious awareness is what, your brain plus conscious awareness is what makes a mind. So then, this was the last study I'll show here. This is brain-to-brain interface with 20 questions. So here on one hand we have a responder, and here we have an inquirer, or perhaps a receiver if we base it on other models. And the responder is given an object that is unknown to this individual. In this case, let's say it's a dog. And the inquirer is asked about the object by selecting with a mouse questions on the display screen from a bank of questions. That question is presented to this player, or this responder, and they see it on their screen, and then they, through looking at a light on one of 2 lights, is able to say yes or no, basically, as a proxy for yes or no. Then, that signal, based on their activity of looking at one light versus another, is fed back to this person, who gets a light flash for yes and no light flash for no. And here's another model of that. This was the largest brain-to-brain interface study yet, with 5 pairs of players. But one thing I wanted to point out to you here is, while this is an interesting model and surely an advance in the step of the preliminary BTBI research such as it is, this is not mind reading per se, this is not accurate transfer of thoughts or emotions. This is a lot of translation and in between steps, translation into binary signals of yes or no, light flashes or no light flashes. This is not me seeing this sentence in my mind and knowing what this person is saying. But that's not to say this isn't doing something, but this is a preliminary work that you would do, but this is to just tell you what the simple stage is that we are at thus far. They claim this is the first demonstration of non-invasive BTBI that we can use to allow humans to guess what's on the mind of another human through interactive question and answering paradigm. And I don't know if, I've never actually played this game, but it's supposed to be one of creativity and skill. And I'm not sure that that's what you actually are able to get out of this game at its current state. Or whether I would, I don't know, I wonder if I would prefer to play it this way or through the cards. I might prefer being the geek that I am, like this way better, I don't know. So then brain nets and organic computers. So one thing that Michaelis says is that he never thinks a computer is going to replace a human. We don't need to worry about the singularity because it's never, artificial computer, a simulated brain is never going to be the same as an actual brain. In fact, let's stop this funny business with these prosthetics. I'd rather just use another brain as a prosthetic. And that's what he did. He continued to connect a couple of brains. So 3 monkey brains synchronize their activity to move a virtual arm in 3 dimensions. Each monkey was implanted with 4 to 8 96-channel arrays. So again, the more channels, the more electrodes for recording, the better the signal. They were trained to use a joystick to operate an avatar arm, and then they were trained to operate avatar arms without a joystick, only using the electrode array. And when they had a correct arm movement, they were given juice, either, I don't know if it was apple juice or grape juice, but fun fact, that's what they like. And then with their arms restrained, 3 monkeys operated the avatar arm through a first-person perspective, and 2 monkeys operated 2 dimensions each with 50% control. And what was interesting about this is that the monkeys, and there were rat studies too that I won't talk about, were successful in reaching their target, more successful when working as a group than as an individual. and they almost seem to compensate for each other. And the authors say these results suggest that primate brains can be integrated into a brain net, an organic computer that self-adapts to achieve a common motor goal. So what do these data mean? So I can speculate on what it means, but I also wanted to see what the authors said it mean. So from the original publications, and this is a hodgepodge of all of their work, and summarizing some themes, they say that this is a creation of an organic computer that can overcome the limitations of current computers, as I told you. This can enhance decision-making, memory, and social behavior. That would be certainly FAR term. This is hyper-interaction. In hyper-interaction, mediated improvement in social structures, facilitating communication, even possibilities of facilitating communication across language barriers even. We don't need language. We could just do this directly through the brain. Why waste our time? Or clinical applications through rehabilitation, treatment of depression, psychosis, impulsivity. So there are a lot of implications that the authors, or a lot of hopes that the authors might have for this. And as you can imagine, the media absolutely love this. Must have been a field day for the authors. In 2 separate experiments, scientists have formed a network from the brains of monkeys and rats, allowing them to cooperate and learn as a super brain. And here you see a cyborg. You might be able to use this telepathy system for sending simple thoughts from a distance like, I love you. Maybe it could be useful for truly getting inside someone's head when they're struggling to voice their emotions. The future is going to be fun and scary and amazing, friends. And then this is another one where one of the authors waxes poetic. I think most of the world's problems stem from the fact that we have different viewpoints, and we don't understand how other people see or feel about the world. Being able to actually feel what other people are feeling, it would change a lot. And he even talks about applying the method to animals to understand their world and feelings. Another journalist says, there's terrific potential for BBIs, brain-to-brain interface, to one day be integrated into psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, learning motor skills, or even more fantastical situations akin to remote-controlled robots on distant planets or Vulcan-like mind melds, all of Star Trek. And then one of the other authors suggests another clinical application. Imagine having someone with ADHD and a neurotypical student. When the non-ADHD student is paying attention, the ADHD student's brain gets put into a state of greater attention automaticity. And despite all this conversation, we do see some, also some strong measured comments, where in this case, Nicolela says, it's unlikely that humans would ever be able to directly share complex mental experiences, at least not through these devices. You're not going to share your emotions or your personality to a brain net. These are not reducible to a signal, to a digital algorithm. You cannot reproduce these individual human attributes. So we run this series, which I've told some of you about at Emory, called Neuroethics of Neuroscience in the News. And we bring authors, some of whom were discussed today, to come and talk about how they've interfaced with the media. They talk about what their data is, what they said to their PR departments or journalists, what they received back, how they dealt with that, whether they went after the journalists and said you didn't have this right, or whether they were informed by the journalists even and took a new direction in their work. And I think a comment, and you hear it every time, journalists just don't know the science and it's their fault for distorting the truth. And that's really too simple of an answer, right? Because it goes both ways. The scientists, even with your most careful comments, may not understand how it's being heard. And it's important, we can't ignore the fact that hype is actually a strategic resource. This is a reality. In an environment of dwindling funds and a very competitive one, people are seeking every resource. Why do universities have a PR department to begin with? Right, the university sees it as an essential piece. There is some reason why they value that, and it's integrated into the culture. So you can't, except there isn't really any training. This is something that's surprising too. You don't see scientists being trained on how to interface with the media. In fact, you're just told the media always gets it wrong, say la vie. And I think that's a problem. I think there's a way to understand and balance that hype or discussing with the public is an important resource. And how do we manage that in the long term? And in an interview with 144 brain-computer interface researchers, they were given the following statements and asked to disagree completely, mostly agree, all the way up to completely agree on following statements. And I wanted to highlight this one. This is, do you agree or disagree? BCI scientists should moderate their enthusiasm when speaking to the media. And mostly agree and completely agree. Pretty much everyone's on the same page. Moderate your enthusiasm. Okay, so what does that mean? Here's the next question. Each BCI scientist should restrict him or herself to discussing current and near future applications of BCI instead of speculating about long-term applications. Now, the same group who largely said you should moderate your enthusiasm were pretty divided here. A lot of them said, well, yeah, you should restrict yourself to talking about near-term applications, but there were many who disagreed with that. So it's not clear what the role of the scientist is in discussing what the future is, or how they might even skillfully navigate that question. And some solutions would be doing a couple things. So first, you want to convey aspects beyond the technological abilities and limitations. That's an easy question. Oh, the N is small, this isn't really good. But there are larger conversations that need to happen because these technologies invariably just increase, get better. We overcome some of these technical abilities, some more easily than others. And they should move into, early on in the discussions, cultural, social, and societal implications. And importantly, right now we have a focus on highlighting immediate findings. And there aren't long-term trends that are identified. This would help too. Can we go back and reflect upon all these immediate highlights and do a review? This is not part of the journalistic style at this time. Multidisciplinary teams at the neuroscience media interface, including a public member, a social scientist, an ethicist, someone who could adequately talk about what the societal implications and concerns might be. So I mentioned that these technologies are early in their development, that the ends are small. We don't know if they're going to be repeatable or translatable in the future, although they're truly continuing to develop. And this is not unique to brain-to-brain interface. This is something that happens with all technologies. So much so that there are people who have developed, like the Gartners, have developed the hype cycle, the patented Gartner hype cycle for emerging technologies. Now there are strengths and limitations to looking at this, but basically I show you this as a theoretical model for technologies. And they typically go through these 5 stages. The innovation trigger, something happens, new finding is found. This is media boom. Peak of inflated expectations. Then we see the trough of disillusionment. And move on to the slope of enlightenment and then the plateau of productivity. Such is the cycle of new technologies, right? And here, according to their 2015 version of creating this, brain-computer interfaces, that's not even BTBI, are here on the innovation trigger, slowly rising up to their peak of inflated expectations, slowly headed towards their doom, the trough of disillusionment. So how might we, is there a way to maybe flatten this more, or maybe more quickly go here? One important consideration is that the research and development life cycle of a technology does not exist separately from the societies they operate within. So one interesting product of, so you may be aware that President Obama announced as one of his grand challenges, understanding the mysteries of the human brain. So through that was created the BRAIN Initiative, a funding priority for particular types of neuroscience projects. And as part of that project, alongside of it, he assigned his commission for the study of bioethical issues to examine the ethical issues associated with this type of research. From this came 2 reports, Gray Matters 1 and 2, and in those reports explicitly it was outlined how ethics discussions needed to be a part of the entire life of a research experiment, from the beginning of its conception to the enacting of the experiment to the interpretation of the results. And this is, I think that's a sound decision or a sound recommendation. Let's see how we can implement that. So exploring value conflicts early and anticipating implications for society can also help better long-term expectations and help to foster better confidence also with public consumers who may feel like they're more a part of the communication of these findings and also understanding them. And importantly, while this is happening, these types of things are happening in the A lot of things we talked about today are happening experimentally. These things are already migrating beyond the bench and bedside into the consumer world. So some of these technologies, like EEG, have been around a really long time and have been the favorite to modify for consumer products. There are a number of caps. This is a TDCS, a simulation I didn't talk about, / EEG cap. I've worn this. I can tell you that it was not able to detect brain activity in me, so I was a little disappointed. But anyways, there it is. They're looking for more clinical applications. There's transcranial magnetic stimulation, and then there's this community of people who are developing TDCS on their own. This is another stimulation device that's much easier to make. But there's this proliferation of products. They're not necessarily being used for brain-to-brain interface, but this is just a handful of them. These companies keep growing with a growing consumer base. So the last part of my talk, what are the implications for reconceptualizing the self? What can we learn from other technologies and other cultures? And are there really any implications beyond what we've got here with the simple telephone, with the cans in the street? So do these technologies truly offer new opportunities for communication? Do they truly challenge our social lives as we know it, or disrupt who we are? So one thing to note in one of the experiments I didn't tell you about with the rat brain-to-brain interface is that Nicolelis notes that in one of them there was a sensing experiment where the rats had to determine whether via their whiskers, whether they were in a small or a large aperture. And they would adjust their movement to that aperture based on whether it was small or close, either moving left or right. And through transmitted information, the other decoder rat was able to guess, would adjust its movement based on what the encoder rat was being exposed to. And in the study, Miguel Nicolelis says that the narrow aperture, the sensing whiskers of the wide or narrow aperture from one rat, the encoder rat, becomes mapped onto the decoder rat, becoming the decoder rat's experience. So through this device, one rat's experience was able to become another rat's experience, they claimed, one rat's sensory experience. And while that's really fancy, we also have a model for that that's really old, for one experience becoming another person's experience, or a false illusory experience, and that's the rubber hand illusion. Has anyone participated in the rubber hand illusion? Okay, this is, yeah, did you enjoy that? Anyone take a hammer to you afterwards?
I think it was a pen strike.
Yeah. I think that's some dark humor there. So this is a figure by the Boston Globe. I'll explain it. So this is how they tell you to do the rubber hand illusion with a friend. So if you happen to have a realistic looking rubber arm in the closet, then this hallucination is for you. Begin by hiding your actual arm behind a box on the table so that you can't see it, and then arrange the fake arm on the table so that from your point of view, it looks like it could be your hidden arm. A friend, a so-called friend, should then stroke both the real hand and the rubber hand in the same place at the same time, and after a few minutes, you should feel like the fake limb has become your own flesh. Then, have your friend stab the rubber hand, or hit it with a hammer. You'll feel a powerful jolt of anxiety and pain, since your brain is convinced that the rubber hand is real. And this has been done many times and repeated and modified, and it's a very interesting phenomenon where your sensory, your senses can be manipulated through a visual cue. And there are multiple different variations on this.
I find it's pretty interesting that someone stabbing me with a pen, I didn't really react to it, but when they took the rubber hand away, I felt like I was being pulled in that direction.
Oh.
And that was
Interesting. Maybe pens aren't, maybe you need a bigger, like a mace or something. Okay, so that's an illusory hand. What about another body? Another body. So we know that there's plasticity post-injury. Joe Finn's talked about that earlier. We know there's cortical plasticity, rewiring, rerouting, strengthening after stroke, through exercise or forced use. But we know there are also limitations to that plasticity based on the extent and location of the injury. But what about an individual who hasn't had an injury? We know that from tools to movement partners, we can have remapped body schema, that is, senses of our bodies in space. And tools or bodies can become seen as extensions of the self. In fact, we would adapt our behaviors after long-term tool use as if we were still holding that tool. And interestingly, patient participants with interdependent self-construals seem to form a stronger joint body schema than those who have independent self-construals. So those who conceptualize themselves, and they base this based on a cultural scale that's used to examine collectivist versus individualistic cultures. That those who saw themselves as more part of a product as their relationships were more likely to more quickly form this joint body schema. What we don't know is what might happen after even short-term or long-term brain-brain interfaces. We can also learn from virtual reality. I don't know if anyone here plays virtual reality games. Maybe there's no shame? Yeah? Okay. That's not surprising enough, philosopher / neuroscience person to be interested in that. There's something called the Proteus effect. That is the de-individuation of oneself, disrupting identity cues based on what you see your virtual avatar self as being. And your individual behavior within the virtual world can become associated with the visual characteristics of an avatar. And for those reasons, people like even choosing those virtual selves so they can somehow vicariously live that. But it seems that there's a huge body of literature now, and many social psychologists and psychologists are moving to these virtual reality models. Why would they do that? Because they can study, well, first, dwindling funds, right? Psychology is not known for the huge amount of money that comes into the department, although doing great research. But they have a small population of participants, usually undergrads, usually pretty homogeneous. So why not use an online pool of users that are in the US, in Brazil, I can use them all over, and do social experiments that maybe I couldn't have done otherwise, like have one slap another participant. Are there any impacts of that afterwards? And this is an area of research going on, a big group, large body of work's coming out of Stanford. But from some experiments have shown that activities in virtual reality environments can alter behaviors outside of that game, such as inducing helping behavior or more environmentally friendly behaviors. And I don't know if you saw this in the headlines. Anybody recognize this? It's the game Rust. There was a lot of discussion about this because the developers of this game did not let you choose the avatar. So they would choose your gender, choose your race, and people were outraged. Of course, it brought out the grossest part of people's personalities. And talk about homophobic pigs, but yeah, so it brought out a lot. But it's interesting because people felt so attached to choosing those identities, they felt really violated. Of course, female players have been playing male players for a long time, but those male players have not had to play female players before, and that was pretty frustrating for them. So people are really attached to that. And another important point is drones. I think we see continually in national defense, we're moving away, we're trying to take our military personnel out of the war theater. We want to save them, so we're having them operate things like drones, right? Maybe it'll be less trauma, maybe less physical trauma, maybe less emotional trauma, but actually there is a study that shows that you can experience vicarious traumatization, that pilots who engage in drone warfare actually still experience a form of PTSD. So what might happen with BTVI? We don't know. We don't know what kinds of things would be exchanged. We don't know what kind of sensory cues would be exchanged. We don't know what kind of activities that one might be involved in. Even in something as simple as playing that game, shooting a rocket, even if you're involuntarily tapping your finger, would the effects of that transfer would be similar to that of drones? And finally, I'll end on cross-cultural views of self. How might regulation and development of these technologies differ across different cultural values? We know, actually, there's been a lot of reduction of non-human primate research in the US, and that's largely reflecting our cultural values at this time and also some important scientific considerations. But we also see a lot of that work being shifted to China, and that is where a lot of the new genetic alteration technology is going. It's actually where the first sure-to-fail head transplant is going to happen. And yeah, actually, I thought that was a scam for a while, and then I actually was emailed by the person who is spearheading that work, and we had a journal club about his work, and he said, I'm going to do this, why did you not invite me to your event so that I could Skype in and comment? So, shame on me, I didn't think he really would, and And actually, I met somebody who was planning to go to China to do those recordings, so it's actually in progress, who said, I used to be in the military, so, you know, ethics, I don't have these kind of ethical problems. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Like, you have even more ethical problems. But anyway, interesting thing. Anyways, all that to say is different kinds of innovation are going to move based on the values held by that country. And we already know, and I started to mention this earlier, that there are different views on identity, culpability, brain death, and even cognitive enhancement based on what your view of yourself is, whether you're individualistic or collectivist. By individualistic, I mean you see yourself as singular you. By collectivist, and I'm oversimplified, you see yourself as a product of your relationships with those around you. For example, we know that in the realm of cognitive enhancement, if you ask people in China, if you ask students if they care about cognitive enhancement, they don't care as much as we do here because they don't really know about it. But here you often hear in the Western cultures considerations about authenticity and identity. The concerns they have there are more about justice and fairness and distribution, not about authenticity and identity. Why is that? Because who I am isn't an individual self. You can alter my brain all you want, that isn't going to change me. But if all of us have it, that might start to have an impact. So it's really interesting how this might play out. And this is not to say all collectivist cultures, there's a ton of them, look at this map, are going to act the same. This is just an invitation to see that there might be different views that we might use to explore this map, the schema of self. And I also raised the point of the Dalai Lama, who was at Society for Neuroscience in 2005, and he was asked questions from would you do animal research to would you use cognitive enhancers? And many were surprised to hear that he said, yes, I would, because meditating is hard, I'm paraphrasing. And yeah, if I could get there faster, why not? Why wouldn't I do this? And then I bring us back to the paper, who you are is where you are, is a location of the self in the brain or the heart. What's interesting is those who have an independent self-construal tend to see themselves as located in their brain relative to the heart. Those with interdependent self-construals seem to have no preference of brain or the heart. But there's something even more complex than that, just saying brain or heart. And as an example, I mean, in fact, linguistically, we don't even have terms that adequately express, we have linguistic terms that separate mind and body. We don't have linguistic terms that talk about their unity. For example, in Japan, they don't understand the separation between mind and body. There is a word called kokoro, and it's heart, spirit, soul, mind. I did not put heart and spirit and soul and mind, or separate them by hyphens or slashes, because that would be inaccurate. They're intimately interconnected. In fact, Tom Kasulis, who is an East Asian philosopher, says that to describe the individual elements of kokoro as heart and mind, or try to pull those apart, is like describing the Japanese word for water, which you drink, as the elements of two molecules of oxygen and two molecules of hydrogen and one of oxygen. So we just really, in some ways, we should know that we aren't even equipped to talk about these in different ways. And if you find this day difficult, and you find difficulty in understanding self, know that you are not alone. This will probably keep us going for a long time. So this was something that was brought up too. Who gets to tell the story of self? Rommelfanger, who is a famous neuroscientist for many of his works on challenging perception and looking at the brain, says the enduring self can be mapped anatomically to limbic and other associated structures which drive frontal executive processes. Enduring self may turn out to be a form of adaptive self-deception or delusion. But we must consider why that illusion arises. So who gets to make that distinction of whether or not it's illusion, and who gets to police the boundaries of the truth? And this was brought up earlier. And I think importantly to get down to that question, dialogue should be transdisciplinary, in fact, not just transdisciplinary, but entangled, and involve multiple stakeholders, including but not limited to patients, participants, and scientists who can enrich our understanding, especially of brain-to-brain interface, on self-agency, for either therapeutic purposes, which have not been done yet, or for non-therapeutic purposes. So these studies are ongoing now. It'd be interesting to ask scientists what their narratives are of what they think the technology's potential is, what will happen next, what the perceived impact on agency is. And I'm really interested to hear what the participants feel, are their experiences after this. So my final remarks, thank you for staying awake so far, I don't see that anyone's asleep, is that there are enormous technical challenges ahead, no doubt, right? Transmission of complex emotions or ideas is not currently possible. But that doesn't mean it's too early to be discussing some of the ethical issues. The research does not exist separately from the societies it operates within. This work will continue to grow. And getting in on the ground floor, this early stage gives us an enormous opportunity to answer not only basic neuroscience questions about the function of the brain, but also our relationships to technology and how our shared or perhaps evolving values may or can shape its future application. Thank you for your time.
And now, after a quick technical switch out, I think, we'll have Dr. Laura Specker-Sullivan, who's a postdoc in our Center for Sensorimotor Neural Engineering in the Ethics Group, give comments. We'll give Karen a chance to say a few words if she wants, and then open it up to broader discussion.
Taking this as a fun opportunity, I almost see Karen's presentation as an opportunity to talk about cross-cultural issues and ethics and technology. I actually did my dissertation research at the Kokoro Center at Kyoto University. So it's a center that is dedicated to looking at the heart and mind and soul and spirit as completely united. So I was working with philosophers and psychologists and psychiatrists, people who are looking at the same types of questions but in very different ways. So I kind of see what I'm doing here as not really questioning or challenging, but sort of extending and really just putting my own spin on what I see Karen as getting us to think about. So the first question is just, how do we think about ethics in technology? I think there are fundamentally two different ways that we can see ethics as involved here. The first is the ELSI model, right? So the ethical, legal, and social implications of technology and science. And I think that's very much looking at technology as inevitable. It's going to be created, and how do we deal with the ramifications? I think there's another way to think about this, which is, what are the ethical assumptions behind the development of specific technologies? So I think Karen is right that the use of technology by people is what can be ethically assessed. But I also think that the development of technology involves ethics as well, and that's part of what our center is trying to do with thinking about ethics by design. So one thing that I notice when I think about ethical assumptions in research is some cultural influences on technology. So many of these, as Karen notes, are linguistic and practical. They're assumptions about what the self ought to be. The self ought to be autonomous and rational and independent, and many of our technologies are trying to make people more autonomous and rational and independent. Whether it be medicine or technology, that's often our common goal. But I think we can ask where we get that goal from. So Karen points to, right, social, linguistic, cultural factors. I think we can also look at institutional factors. So in another paper that I read by Karen and her group, they look at some of the major funders of BCI research in the US and the UK versus in other places. And she notes that a major funder is the military, is DARPA, right? So we have some certain values that are already going into how this technology is being developed. An interesting distinction here is if you look at Japan, in Japan, the military is not a major funder of this research. I actually am not sure if they're funding any of this research at all. And so one way this plays out is thinking about how we imagine the possibilities of technology. Is technology something that makes people, again, more independent? Is it something that makes people so that they can walk away again without assistance? Or is it something that helps people who are in need? Is technology something that offers support? Or is it something that provides new means of control? So while a lot of our medical technologies do focus on making people more rational, autonomous contributors to society, I think as Karen notes in some of the news articles that we see, some of the imaginative explorations of what technology might be able to do, we can see ways in which technology might, instead of transmitting the experience of being focused from one student to another student, from a student without ADHD to a neurotypical student, what if that experience of having ADHD went in reverse? What if a student without ADHD, a student who was neurotypical, could experience what it was like to not be able to pay attention? What if we had technologies that actually enabled these types of empathetic responses? There was a study that did something similar to this that was looking at how actually viewing a video of what it's like to be a care worker in Africa during the Ebola crisis, what that did to participants, whether it gave them more empathetic responses to the experiences of people going through this epidemic. So what if we thought about these technologies again as enabling empathy or social responses rather than focusing on the individual, autonomous, rational self? So again, trying to be short here to stimulate discussion, but just in conclusion, I think ethics involves not just asking how do we develop new biomedical technologies, how do we get informed consent, how do we avoid therapeutic misconception, how do we balance benefits and harms, but why? Why do we pour all of this money and social effort into developing certain types of technologies over others? And I see this as a question that doesn't squelch research, right? The goal of cross-cultural work isn't to show what some cultures are doing and say that it's bad, or show what our culture is doing and saying it's good, but to look at different creative responses to what's identified as social problems. And I think this makes research ultimately more creative, more novel, and more responsive to the needs of diverse populations. Because the reality is that when you're looking at interdependent versus independent self-construals, yes, we can make generalizations across cultures, but we also live in very diverse societies. And so we have many people within the US and Canada and North America that have interdependent self-construals. And Asia has many people with independent self-construals. So how can we think about both when we're developing technologies in order to meet these diverse needs?
Thank you. We have a little time for questions for either or both of them. Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Hi. So one of the things that you brought up that I thought was particularly interesting was how sort of the media can often distort or change the way that the research is coming across. And I wanted to ask you sort of to what extent do you think the diction that we use, I mean, we call them BCIs, we call them BMIs, you know, how does that affect the way that we're progressing with this research and the way that people are understanding this research?
Do you have, in that, I'll answer that, but do you have a proposal for a different language?
No, not at all. It's just a matter of that, I mean, one of the things that I've been helping with the research is going through and sort of looking at, okay, how do we talk about this? And like, when you're looking at research papers, I mean, we have like a whole, you know, different synonyms for the same thing that we're looking at just in order to, you know, find what we're looking for. And I'm wondering how that potentially affects like the way that people are understanding this technology. I mean, you come up with things like telepathy. That's something that people understand, but it's not actually something that we're talking about. And I'm wondering if that's because of the way that we're using the language, or if that's affecting it, or if that's just a matter of miscommunication.
Yeah. Well, yes, language is important. And it's certainly critical. I mean, the trick is understanding what the implicit meanings, you know, what kind of baggage is already carried within those terms, and who carries that. So, you know, first, there is a legacy of language that's used within each discipline, right? And brain-to-brain interface comes from, it's a natural transition from brain-computer interfaces and computer CBI. I mean, there's a lot of terms there. And terms like telepathy are really loaded, and science fiction has given us those terms. Thank you, science fiction, for that. Appreciate that. But so it's hard to really disentangle that, because some of that truly is what has been what inspired scientists to begin with. So some of these scientists will say, I read this science fiction story and I wanted to make it happen. And I don't think we want to curb that. Margaret Atwood, a science fiction writer, came to one of our symposium we had actually on genetic engineering. And she advocated for blue sky science. You know, she said, I really think we should do that. If you want to pull from science fiction to get there, I recommend that. So I wouldn't want to curb that. I guess the hope is when you're explaining it that you are able to tap into, be able to, I think a seasoned scientist who has talked about particularly exciting to the public work, has learned that certain words they use trigger certain responses. And that's really a social science kind of endeavor. So I think what might really be beneficial is if there is a way, that's an empirical question, and I think you're starting to do that work, is to ask what are the embedded meanings in these terms, how do different groups use them. You know, I can tell you that we, from the American Academy of Neuroradiology, we co-hosted a symposium where we invited neuroradiologists who were frequently asked and neurologists who were called to serve as expert witnesses in the courtroom. Right? And they had a series of jargon that they used. We also brought in lawyers that used that information, statisticians, and although they were all talking about the same, when they looked at an image, the same diagnosis, some of them used that language more casually, some of them knew that it didn't mean exactly what they thought it meant, and lawyers were taking it really literally. So all of that just basically became a storm of misunderstanding and misapplication that wasn't even not always intentional. So I think that's an interesting question to pursue. Thanks for your question.
I'll follow on while you guys are thinking about it. So I found it so interesting because I was just having a conversation with a 7-year-old yesterday about what thoughts are, and you know, where are they and what are they, and if you have a big thought versus a little one, is the size anything, right? So you were, I think, saying, right, no neuroscientist knows what a thought is or could really say what that is, which might be right, but then I can understand why you would use that language too in trying to make it accessible to the public. So, right, if the sender is thinking fire, right, fire, hit the button, that we do think of that as a thought. So then I guess part of the question is, right, to avoid the hype and the thoughts are causing these things, what other language, what would there be there that's both translatable, right, but accurate enough?
Yeah, I wish I had that.
Yeah.
No, I think that the point is to understand what is the power of the tool that we have within our given, what is in my toolkit as a neuroscientist? Can I tell you what a thought is currently with my toolkit? You know, and I think that's the question to ask. If I break down a thought, what do I mean when I'm saying that? Do I mean that this electrical firing pattern, when thought is still maybe a construct that can't really be explained via a neuroscience tool. Maybe it could be explained in a psychological sense, but I think that's the challenge. So how do you fix that? I mean, I think that one, the scientists use it because it's publicly understandable, it seems. But I think when you have more time and more space and linguistic space in media, I think then you take the time to pull it apart and you take time to emphasize it when you can. And that's how you get away from the telepathy piece, I think. I'm almost wondering if you just have to say, it's not telepathy every single time, because I feel like that's
Every
what
other sentence.
I think that's what I have to say.
Joe.
So it was a fascinating talk, and as I was listening, I was thinking, gee, aren't telephones great? It's a brain-to-brain interface. And then you actually have the slide of the Parisian woman on the phone or something at the end. And I was just wondering, I remember my son said, I have a 13-year-old, he says, you can get the radio on your iPhone. And I said, well, we had radios. So what is it about, and I'm watching all the interface that you need to have, the Wi-Fi, the cable, to the computer, to the email, to the internet, back to the other computer, the decoding, and I'm thinking ears are pretty good, and so I understand the scientific curiosity. Well, why are we looking, for less good technology for brain-to-brain interface? I could say fire right now, and chances are that if I asked you to draw a picture of a fire, it would look, given that we had similar artistic abilities, which I suspect mine are not that great, we would basically draw the same picture. So what is it about the technology that's so seductive, and it seems like we're using something less good than what we already have.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So why even do this? Wouldn't I much rather play 20 questions, in person instead of using all these devices? But I think what you said made me think of, isn't it really beautiful that in thinking we're creating a complex device, that we actually understand how much more complex we are?
Yeah.
And I think that's what these devices right now are interested in, understanding the complexity of a typically healthy functioning brain. And that's kind of how all science works when we reverse engineer and try to think about how to help those who have an injured brain. So I think there's some utility to that. And I think there's utility in being able to refine the technologies we have. We may scrap these technologies completely. They may even just become fun gaming toys like they are now. But for now, I think they are an interesting research tool.
I mean, there was a slide, on one of my slides I didn't talk about, but Lewis Thomas talked about halfway technologies. And these are halfway to halfway technologies. And as I was watching this, it was a really interesting talk. And I was thinking about the cochlear implants and how the first time I heard about how they work, I think it's a 96 array, and you just stick it in, and the brain figures out the interface. We don't have to do any programming. The brain actually is able to take that auditory information, translate the auditory information, and encode it into neural information. So I think it does give us a sense of the sophistication of the technology that we're embedded with. I don't say endowed because that's a loaded term, but I think it's an interesting question about are we fetishizing the technology more, and is that distracting us from the medical, the clinical, the biological? Because one of the things that I've written about, that I worry about, is that all the hype about mind reading and telepathy, undermines the legitimate use of these technologies to restore people who have, problems that need restoration, the hearing impaired, and so I think that, when you talk about the hype, there is a lot of hype, and the hype can engender funding, but can also scare people into saying, we're not going to fund that.
Mm-hmm. I think what's really interesting, if you look at I generally don't recommend this, looking at comments of articles. I still don't recommend it. But if you were to, an interesting mix is what you see is the thrill of the fright. It's not so scary, I don't want to try it, but ooh, isn't it scary? We go see scary movies, there's something we like about that, and that's, others postulate that's mass group therapy, but, I don't know that it's really going to scare us off. There'll be enough who are fascinated by it, and that actually is more of my fear, that it's so fetishized that really unripe as it is, it's being taken out into the consumer population, and even then, maybe there are limited harms there. But one of the fears that I'm sure you've heard Nita Farahani talk about is that this becomes kind of routinized pedestrian behavior. I buy all these technologies, they get better, and I just get used to willfully sending my electrical signals through a Bluetooth insecure Bluetooth signal that somebody else owns my brain activity patterns, and if their company fails, then that information is sold to another company. And then you have a number of these wearable devices. I don't know how many people in here have a Fitbit, but there's just this constellation of information that we freely give all the time, and then it's just a habit. And then if it does get refined, then we use these technologies, and then what we're used to it. So when I was in China recently, they had through the in the subway station, they had this security check where you could put your bag through. And as a visitor, I did the tourist thing, and I actually put my bag through the security check. And my friends were like, no, you don't do that. You don't need to do that. It's just there. And then the next time I went there, everybody was doing it, and it was required. So the thing was, it just became so normal. It became just like a rock or a fan there, and it just became mindless. Like, I guess I'll do it. I guess I'll use it. Maybe sometimes I use it. Maybe I don't. And then they move slowly into this. You use it all the time, and it was a really brilliant way to get that kind of mass surveillance done without actually forcing it upon somebody. And I'm not saying that's the intention, especially with the DARPA conversation of these developers, but I'm just saying that we wouldn't want to miss the possibility of them getting better and people using them outside of that.
I have so many questions and comments. I'll try to keep it brief. But first I want to hit Joe's point. The reason your son is interested is that he can send text messages to his friends while he's in class without moving muscle or speaking or looking around with his eyes, right? I mean, that's sort of the dream of brain-to-brain communication. And I think it's important to point out necessarily your son. Because he's 13 and he has an iPhone. I mean, that's the generation that's interested in that. It's important to point out, though, the state of the art, right? The current state of the art. You sort of did it in your slides, but I don't think you quite went deep enough. And Andre's gone now, but you heard me saying this. Basically, every one of these studies is a media stunt to date. I mean, they are. You say they interpret the intention to fire, but it wasn't even that. It was imagining moving their hand or imagining moving their tongue, things that we know can drive EEG signals. And really and the animal experience were, a nice decoder that decoded which lever the animal was pressing, that's what that threshold is, that sigmoid function in the middle. And when the decoder figured out which lever is pressing, it just sent a very simple stimulus to the other animal. And we already know that animals can learn to discriminate one versus another stimulus and choose a lever. So really, all the studies today are just putting together technology that already existed. The EEG BCI, which is horribly reduced dimensionality, maybe 1-2 degrees of freedom at a time, with TMS, which we know can make someone twitch, right? So it's not sending an idea, it's decoding one person's intention to move and then forcing the other person to move, basically with a magnetic pulse to their brain, right? So it's that simple, and animal studies are really no more complex. I mean, I would argue in Nikolaos' study with the 3 monkeys, the brain-computer interfaces to date are so bad that averaging together 3 animals doing a bad brain-computer interface cancels out some of the noise, and on average you get better performance, right? That's what's going on. It's not that they're collaborating per se. So I think it's really important to find out that we don't get caught in this media hype. I mean, the reason that Raj and Andre did the press release is because they knew the other paper was coming out and they wanted the media splash, and the media ate it up, right? It's like, oh, 2 brains communicated with doing this, so cool. But really, it's just EEG, BCI to TMS, both have been around for decades, and they happen to be the first ones to link them together. But there was no science advance. But there is the possibility for science, right? There's this possibility if we can get high bandwidth communication, that you could have collaborative learning. You could create these co-processors, these neural networks, where brains could help each other solve problems and things like that. And that happens to some extent in crowdsourcing, right? Just through using your fingertips. But I think that's the worry, is that we hype it too much. It cancels the possibility, the funding for actual real scientific advance. So you have to be really cautious with how much we push. And as you said, it takes away that it distracts from the human subjects who might actually need it. Right? At the moment, it doesn't augment anyone's function. But how do you then keep the funding lines open so that you can help the people who do need to communicate? Someone who's locked in with ALS could benefit from these EEG P300 spells, right? They do benefit from them. So you have to be really cautious. I think how much we push it, how much we hype it, how much we debate the advances if they're not really scientific advances. It's not really a question, that's just too many comments.
Well, they're not new comments. I mean, and I really appreciate hearing those comments. I think I have a couple just genuine questions back, and that's, okay, yes, and I think I didn't say it strong enough, but these technologies are not, they didn't develop a new technology that wasn't there, right? They use pieces of things, which is why I showed the pieces to begin with. Now, the question is then, so why was it packaged and sold to the public in this way, and why will this be the first time the public hears about it? So what was happening before that wasn't getting it out to the public? So, I mean, this is a question. So if I have someone in the public, and I want to learn about TMS, or TDCS, or one of these, am I going to learn about, is my first foray into this going to be when I'm on Reddit, and I see this cool game Huffington Post? How am I going to gain a deeper interest into that science without someone packaging in a way that is actually going to interest me? My second question is, do you have empirical data that would show an example, and I really want to see this, and I'm sure some of it's out there, that shows are you in the field of, sorry that I don't know, but I should know, of brain-computer interface? Do you have an example of when science a project has not been funded, specific projects have not been funded or undermined because of public backlash about the brain-computer interface because it was overhyped?
It's not the brain-computer interface specifically, but I'm sure there are examples in neural devices in general.
Well, there's the legacy of psychosurgery that Jokin's talked about, and that's definitely the case. So what's interesting about these technologies, and I don't know if this is good or bad, it's probably bad, especially your view, is that they are seemingly harmless because they're non-invasive. It's not, and non-invasive, we talked about this at our, oh my gosh, ad nauseum at American Academy of Art and Sciences, isn't really true, right? So if I stimulate from the outside, this is an example somebody else did with the TMS device, and that moves my finger, and it goes through my skull to my brain, and down my spine, to activate my muscles in my finger. Is that non-invasive? It doesn't look invasive. It looks pretty and slick, and it's white, and it has these devices. The Motive has these beautiful devices. Everybody's good looking and young and fit, you know. So there is I would be concerned about that, them seeming more harmless than they are. But I also think we should genuinely ask how we might interface better, because it doesn't help. It doesn't actually help either to say, well, these technologies have already existed, and we're not really going to talk about it to people outside these consumer domains. So I think there needs to be more of a shift where scientists recognize that, and I think some do, maybe too much so, that they are the purveyors of their work. You know, they should be the ethical stewards of that work, and that means responsibility of talking not just to your community but to the public too. So how might you do that? And I don't know that we have enough formal training mechanisms in place to really foster that, or as we were talking about earlier, incentives.
And I think it's a cultural problem, because certainly Raj had no idea that their press release would generate the kind of interest that it did. You know, they started with a fairly modest press release, they linked two brains together, and then the headline writers get a hold of it, brain-to-brain communication, telepathy, etc. And more reporters started calling, and they got totally out of hand. Like, I can't believe that there's so much interest in this study, because they knew that it was just a stunt, right? That it was just two existing technologies. But as you point out, people may not have heard about EEG before this, at least not in this context. So at least the general public gets excited about it. But I think that each researcher, as you mentioned, has a responsibility when they're dealing with the media to be very careful not to overhype. As much as possible, insist on fact-checking everything that's written about your work, dialing back, doing rebuttals if you need to try to correct misconceptions, because the headline writers are not the correspondents that you work with, right? So the headline writers will say we cured paralysis every 5 years, whether or not we have. And that unfortunately is going to be there, but at least if the article is written in a tempered manner, such that the patients and their families don't have false expectations raised by every single discovery that we have, every incremental discovery, then that's at least the way you can both get the word out but still keep it in perspective.
And I'll just say one last thing. I know there are a lot of questions, but I just feel like I should respond to this. Stunt, snake oil. You know, what you said, and I agree with the way you explain these technologies work. I agree with exactly how you explain the rat brain-to-brain interface. I agree with how you said the human brain-to-brain interface work. And while you say it's simplified and that uses existing technologies, I would still say, well, they did something, but maybe it was boring, right? So they still, but I wouldn't say it was boring. I don't think it's boring. They still did it, though. They did not utilize those technologies, as pedestrian as they may seem. They did not try to convey a very simple signal, even if it was basically a binary signal, to another being. They did not. So I still think, well, they did that. They still did this, and they're further refining that. So the snake oil part and the stunt part is how it proliferated from there. So I think it's, well, yes, they're intimately related. I think there are probably slightly more generous ways to be, and I hope that being a little more generous will facilitate a greater conversation and more positive outcomes.
Sure. I don't think I used the term snake oil. I did use the term.
No, you didn't use snake oil.
I used the term you used for rock.
I mean, I've heard it from others. That's not your term. Snake oil is kind of harsh.
It's a little hard.
Okay, I apologize. So,
Yeah, I just had something to go off with Chet, which is that like when I work in engineering, when my advisor comes to me and asks me for a demo of something that I'm working on, he doesn't ask me for, okay, build in a part where you show the limitations, you know, like show, like when I'm just supposed to show a demo that works. I'm not supposed to show, okay, but when you do this, it actually stops working. And in any of these videos, you can put a section in that's, you know, okay, when you try to use this thought instead, it stops working. And so therefore it shows you something, it shows the public something about, it's not every thought, you know, it's not totally translating thoughts, it's actually only translating in a small subset. And so I think, and like, we have a couple thousand kids on campus today looking at demos about science, and I think those demos are probably set up very similarly. You know, when you design a demo, you want to do something flashy that works, and I think in terms of actually educating the public, you could do a lot more service by, you know, not necessarily watering down our demos, but making them a little more nuanced and saying, okay, like here's where the barrier is, and here's where it kind of stops working.
like a blooper reel.
Yeah, actually, yeah.
Like the DARPA robotic challenge, right? Who's seen the
Oh,
blooper reel
yeah.
of the DARPA
And
robotic
that's also so fun
After
to
you watch
watch.
that, you're like, okay, we won't have robots in our homes just yet, because they can't figure out how to get the door open without pulling.
Yeah, we don't have to surrender to our robot overlords
Yeah,
this
that was
time.
so much more fun to watch than a bunch of videos of robots like working successfully. And I sent that video around to a lot of people because I thought it was, funny and interesting.
So, in response to the question, is the never not led to funding or something, media portrayal, I think the Robo-Rat did a lot of damage. And I think it was around 2002-ish or something. And The Economist had this amazing editorial saying this had posed a greater threat to human dignity than stem cell research. I mean, it was their spin on it. So I think a couple things we should really think about is like when we write our press releases, we really try to dampen it down. We try to be, we write our own press releases before we give it to the PR people. Because if you control the text, most newspaper people are lazy. They'll just kind of reproduce what you give them. The really good science writers will actually write their own articles, but most people will just export what you give. But the bigger question really is the readership and its scientific literacy. And the reason why people don't get it and they don't have critical thinking is because they weren't trained to think and read science critically. And I think this is a STEM issue. This is another place where the humanities and STEM come together, because we really have to make sure that this kind of education is part and parcel of what we consider important for delivery of democracy. Undergraduates, high school kids should learn a little bit about scientific method and all. And I think long term, it's better for us to be more modest in what we claim that we're able to do, because there's a whole market out there, right? That's going to assess whether or not these things are going to be viable or not. And if we overhype it, that curve you show gets even deeper and worse. And there is that what they call the the valley of death. And you have proof of principle. Have you heard about the valley of death? You take a proof of principle, and how do you get it to a product? And the more that valley gets deeper and harder to traverse if the heights are higher. And so we really need, I think if we're a little more tempered in what we say, these things will have more lasting ability to get to market and to become real products. Because the flash in the pan, we only get burned with that. We don't actually have any illumination.
Yeah. I wouldn't disagree with an attempt, I think this is something you said well too, to be measured as a scientist, to be careful and involved in your press release. That will not inoculate you against, and I think what's important, as I said in my presentation, is this is a multiple stakeholder conversation involved in the media and neuroscience interface. Education just shouldn't be, the responsibility shouldn't just be put on the public to enlighten themselves, nor should it just be put on scientists to be better.
It's a multimodal approach.
Yeah, and I think those values have to be instilled and shared and incentivized.
If I can jump in though, I want to play devil's advocate here and suggest that press releases are not about modesty. I mean, that's not what's happening. And press releases are, quite frankly, not about science literacy either, right? Press releases are about advertising, and we really ought to think about what's
What's the
happening.
purpose of a university but to educate? It's not to hype. I mean, this is a place where ideas matter and where there's standards. I mean, your talk was an example of a measured, deliberate, careful, nuanced
But
talk.
I didn't-
I think the standards for how this is a public university. Universities have a public responsibility to.
I agree with
Yeah.
all of that. I
Yeah.
I mean, when I started going to university as a student, there wasn't this phenomena of press releases. There wasn't the PR machinery behind the university. And I'm just saying, we need to be aware of the way in which the university as an institution writ large has become corporatized, even in the context of publicly funded universities. So I was just wanting to say, we should,
We should
and
try
even your
not to
comment
contribute.
about, trying to get the press release out, is because they knew what was happening and they wanted to position themselves. And I think we need to be aware of that. So I think that's why you have this sort of like, well, no, the press release isn't about saying all we can do and all we can't do. The press release is about saying we're great, we're wonderful, we're doing all these exciting things in a way that doesn't lie, out and out lie, but it is there to create a certain kind of impression. So I think we just need to be careful about the way in
Yeah,
which
and
we're
I
working.
think if I could add from our series that we've had, I don't know, dozens of speakers now who have talked about how they've interfaced with their universities, and it's really not all uniform. So you may have a very good press release department who have a lot of fidelity to science and really rely on fact checking. I don't know, but there are some that don't, and some are better than others, some are motivated for different reasons, some maybe see their mission as more as communication, some may not. I mean, what you don't want to do is go into the development arm of any university and come out like needing a stiff drink. But I mean, I think it's unfair though to think it should just be this way, so it will be this way.
Well, I was to add, because I think this is, really an important point, and we haven't talked about the market or any of these other issues, but, universities have worked really well precisely because they weren't corporations. Corporations have worked really well because they weren't universities. And that interface, the tech transfer issue, is probably from, catalyzing these kinds of excesses. And it goes back in large part to the Bayh-Dole Act of 1982, right? Which, those of you who don't remember it, it was in the old days, you would get funding from the government, and the notion was that the government would then commercialize the products with industry, and nothing was happening. And so in order to catalyze tech transfer, the universities that received the federal grants became the patent holders of the ideas, and then they could negotiate with industry in order to accelerate from bench to bedside in product development. And that commodified much of what science is about. And there's been, it's been a good thing in large part, but it's had its underside. And I think part of that is what we're talking about, because you're looking to commodify ideas, and so you can sell it so that either sustains your research endeavor, brings more resources into the lab. And Jonas Salk, when he was asked about commercializing the polio vaccine, he said, "Would you patent the moon?" I think he said something like that. So the idea that the place of royalties, patents, and that kind of external funding has really changed over the last 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, and I think, with all due respect, where you sit within the university and the status of your career allows you to make certain kinds of statements about the way the university should be and how well you are able to implement those values. So tenure certainly grants certain things like that. But I mean, this is a much longer conversation we're not going to talk about, but that, commodification of education, adjunctification, gross abuses of human labor within the university and the transition. I mean, this is a whole other conversation.
All right, we don't want to go to the trough of disillusionment.
Yeah, it's going to go really bad.
We're going to be on our upward trajectory from that trough. Let's take 10 minutes, we'll come back at 4, and I'll have all the speakers of the day and the commentators up for other questions. I know I have a lot I didn't get to ask because I was the MC. Hopefully you have other questions too, and we'll just let that go on as long as it will.